Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to wherever you are. I'm thankful to be invited to moderate the discussion that we have today around this beautiful book, Qohelet, Searching for a Life Worth Living. And we have the authors with us today, Professor Menachem Fisch and Debra Band. It's beautiful. It's really a gift kind of coffee table book, but it's also got philosophy in it, and it's got biblical scholarship, and it's got essays and introductions by the most illustrious intellectuals and so forth. So it's like there's something for everyone in this, and it's very rich, and it was a labor of love, as you shall see. And it is from the artist Debra Band, who is with us today. And she is known to me from her first volume in this series that she did on the Song of Songs, where she's doing illuminated manuscripts in the old medieval tradition of taking a page and sanctifying it with her art in a real way. With Menachem Fisch is here too. Menachem Fisch is the one who provides the philosophical thread running through this volume. He's a very well-known name within Jewish study circles and philosophical circles. And what he does is bring his father's essay that awakened his attention to Qohelet, to Ecclesiastes, and he talks about how his father mentioned Karl Popper, who Professor Fisch was really interested in, and that got him on the road to reading Qohelet. And then he went and wrote a bunch about it, but he's made it available and accessible for us in this volume. So he's a professor at Tel Aviv University. He does a lot at Frankfurt University and the Goethe Institute, let me get it right, the Goethe University Frankfurt's Forschungskolleg and Humanwissenschaften. And he also has a Frankfurt Tel Aviv alliance there. He's kind of a European-oriented Tel Aviv Israeli thinker.
Thank you, Thea, for organizing this event, and you, Jacob, for agreeing to host it. It's a pleasure to be in Oxford, if only virtually. Let's get straight to it. Any viable reading of Ecclesiastes, of Qohelet, must be clear about its overall premise and the subsequent question that Qohelet poses in verses 2 and 3 of the first chapter. Okay, so let me share my screen. So, the premise is that all, but all, is hevel, a word in Hebrew repeated 5 times in the course of that opening verse. And the question is, what yitaron, and I'm keeping those 2 words in Hebrew for a moment, has a man of all his labor wherein he labors under the sun. In other words, if all, but all, is hevel, whatever that means, what yitaron, whatever that means, can any human endeavor boast to have under the sun? Now, of the 2 Hebrew terms, yitaron is the most straightforward, taken invariably as profit, advantage, or value. But the question of the profit, advantage, or value of human endeavor under the sun changes significantly according to how one understands the key term hevel. Now, following the Vulgata, most read hevel as connoting vanity, in other words, meaninglessness, emptiness, futility, in one case, even absurdity, which renders Qohelet's question then rhetorical. If anything a person can ever think or do amounts to nothingness and futility, what value indeed can human undertaking ever boast? And Qohelet is then read by many as proving the worthlessness of all serious human effort, and as advocating, say, on the basis of chapter 9, enjoying life while one can, while on the basis of chapter 12, fearing God and obeying his command. But even the very best of such readings, and the essay that Jacob mentioned by my father is perhaps the best of such readings, leaves much of the text unattended. the curious change of tone at the beginning of chapter 3, of which I'll speak in a moment, the sober counsels of chapter 6 and 7, the political musings of chapter 4, the wise farmer of chapter 11, and much, much more. So I read Qohelet's Hevel premise differently. The term is indeed employed in the Bible to denote meaningless and futility, but only with respect to idolatry and idolaters. When the same term, Hevel, is applied to human life, it is employed more literally to connote a mist-like temporality. Which, though transient, is not necessarily futile nor absurd, of course. And because applied in Qohelet not only to the human lifespan, to the idea that, you know, the fact that our life is limited, but to human understanding and undertaking, I take Qohelet's Hevel premise as deeming them to be not only transient and fleeting, but inherently time-bound, historical. So if all we can ever accomplish is forever contingently grounded in the ever-changing here and now, Qohelet asks, if what we deem undeniably true and good today may be denied tomorrow, if we can never be sure of what we are sure, what could ever count as an undertaking of proven worth? How, under conditions of perpetual doubt, can we lead a life for whose value we can vouch? And that question, of course, is not rhetorical. The next 8 verses of chapter 1 restate the question in terms of the dismal incongruity between what us philosophers dub ontology and epistemology, between nature's timeless, law-governed cycles in gold and our time-bound and hence wholly inadequate attempts to picture them in white. Doomed to live in a world we can never assuredly understand, we perceive it as unfolding in time, while in truth, writes Qohelet, there is nothing new under the sun, nor is memory of any help, because accruing time-bound pictures can never yield a timeless portrayal. And it is at this point that Qohelet switches from the third person, the sort of distant, remote philosopher, to the tortured personal testimony of a profoundly religious thinker who gives his heart to seeking by wisdom concerning all things under the heaven, only to find that what God has given man, and note the word given, to be exercised by, is a bad and an evil matter, inyan ra in Hebrew. Talking of what God has given us to contend with strongly implies that the basic discrepancy between reality and how we comprehend it cannot be diminished by divine revelation. God's 2 books, that of nature and that of scripture, authored in timeless perfection that wholly transcends the ever-changing vagaries of human understanding, are therefore ungraspable as such by those God has made responsible for his world and made the covenantal recipients of his word. Just as the natural world is comprehended so very differently by people and cultures of different times and circumstance, as the history of science bears vivid witness, so will God's revealed word be inevitably understood very differently by its various recipients, inevitably refracted by their diverse languages and diverse perspectives. God, as it were, is incapable of controlling his message. And so, oblivious to the very standards by which we are expected to abide and be judged, how can we prudently subject ourselves to God's will if we can never know it for certain? This states an anxious and distraught Qohelet is the evil and crushing matter we are obliged by God to respond to, la'anot bo in his Hebrew, in tortured realization of our total inadequacy to do so. But what causes Qohelet to realize the full horror of his predicament are his two dismally failed attempts to undermine it. Being of supreme wisdom, he states, speaking now as King Solomon, I set upon a keen study of human wisdom itself, hoping to achieve certain understanding, but only to find that even the wisest of humans is only humanly wise, and hence incapable of surpassing reason's inherent time-boundedness. Much wisdom is much anger, ka'as in Hebrew, not grief, as most English translations have it. And he that increases knowledge increases pain, machov in Hebrew, not sorrow, as the English versions have it. And what cannot be achieved by wisdom cannot be achieved by the best of works. Chapter 2 portrays Solomon's reign as a paradigm of utilitarian morality, not merely the story of an indulgent rich man's successes, but that of a king who achieved more for his country than any other. Yet Solomon's rule, unrivaled achievement, is no less transient than his wisdom. And Qohelet's despair knows no limit, causing him by the end of chapter 2 to hate life and to despair of his entire life work. However, this darkest of biblical passages is not where Qohelet's argument terminates, as many have it. It is where it begins. And the contrast between the dark loathing of life at the end of chapter 2 and the buoyant optimism of the Song of Seasons that opens chapter 3 is dramatic. In realizing that for everything there's a season and a time for every purpose under the heaven, Qohelet seems able to re-embrace life and revisit almost verbatim the heart-gripping quandary for which he set forth, yet with no anger and bitterness. He now deems the task with which God gave us to contend no longer a painful or evil matter, no longer an inyan ra. Something happens at the beginning of chapter 3, which Pete Seeger caught so well in his upbeat rendition of the song. What I believe Qohelet realizes with a jolt at the opening of chapter 3 is that God's timeless ways and perfect norms are indeed humanly unknowable. But for him to hold us accountable to standards we are in principle incapable of knowing would constitute a violation of God's perfect justice. Because he cannot but be aware of our inherent time-boundedness, he created us, of course. It is unthinkable that he'd hold us to his perfect standards. I therefore read the opening verse of chapter 3. Because God created us and our world in time, it is pertinent that every divine desire and expectation from us under the heaven will also be time-bound. God will judge us not in accord with his timeless standards, but by the quality of our time-bound assessments. He does not expect us to arrive at absolute criteria for planting, building, or waging war, but to do our time-bound best to decide if to plant now, or uproot, kill, or heal, wage war, or make peace. With a great sigh of relief, Qohelet realizes that the task we face is no longer devastating. God has given the world in our heart, given for our responsibility, full aware that no man can comprehend it from beginning to end. We are expected to do our humanly time-bound best to do good, not to somehow meet unknowable divine standards of goodness. And in referring back to the world, we cannot ever fully grasp, I think Qohelet enables today's readers to appreciate his dramatic change of heart. This is where Karl Popper comes in, for those who are acquainted with his thought. The very idea of proven scientific truth we now, thanks to Popper, realize is a conceit. Scientific laws cannot be proved. Scientists form hypotheses, test them to the best of their ability, and replace them when found wanting. At its uttermost best, science remains time-bound and fallible. Yet no one would therefore consider science an absurd, meaningless, or futile undertaking. Qohelet will extend this insight to all serious human judgment and attempt to determine what amounts to doing one's humanly best in this regard. So after dealing with some preliminaries, such as the delightfully anti-Hobbesian account of social cohesion in conditions of radical diversity in chapter 4, and delineating the two forms of folly that he'll have little patience with in upcoming chapters, Qohelet embarks on his own positive account of wise human conduct with a powerful, if largely misread, image. What yitaron has the wise man over more than the fool, he asks. What a poor man has who knows how to go against life. Male ani yodea lahaloch neged hachayim. Okay, the advantage of the wise man is like the poor man who knows how to go against life. Critical of what life has dealt her and determined to change it, the poor person assumes responsibility by imagining different ways to improve her lot and scrutinizing them critically before settling on a way forward. Keenly combining value judgment and informed speculation, she applies her standards, her time-bound standards of propriety, to exposing what she deems to be wrong with her world and imagines putting right, but knowing that she is liable to err and even if right, liable to be unsuccessful. But Qohelet also knows that even the wisest are very poor self-critics. Because we use our norms to criticize, it is impossible to hold them in critical review. And so chapter 7 is about enhancing self-criticism by self-exposure to similarly trying situations and to the normative critique of people who are committed differently. Therefore, the diversity of human opinion becomes an asset. Better to seek a good name than precious ointment, to go to houses of mourning rather than to those of mirth, to seek the rebuke of the wise rather than the praise of fools, and so forth. And it ends with the sobering realization that even maxims considered undeniably valid, such as to forever avoid the company of certain types of corrupt women, remain forever uncertain because they are never applicable with certainty. So it may be an absolutely certain truth that we should avoid such people, but we can never say about a specific person with certainty that he or she falls within that category. After ingeniously combating the only rival position he deems serious, benign hedonism, and setting an Aristophanic dystopia of a city run by fools against a Qohelet wise farmer tilling his field in the face of uncertainty, Qohelet, having solved his problem, can declare, in deliberate contrast to chapter 2's dark despair, that raising our eyes from our human vantage point under heaven, truly the light is sweet, matok ha'or ba'inayim, and a pleasant thing it is for the eyes to behold the sun. no longer crushed by the unbreachable chasm between God in heaven and we upon earth, we have come to understand that despite our inherently time-bound, heavenly existence, it is possible to lead a divinely approved life, wisely led and worth living. And Qohelet can finally face death, not as a denial of life's worth, but as a natural culminating development, tenderly describing us departing this world, accompanied by the equally transient, soon to be outmoded fruits of our accomplishments, which are so, as you will see, so beautifully depicted by Debra. And as my late father, who was mentioned before, Harold Fish, aptly noted, there was never a gentler poem on the approach of death, which becomes the beauty of a golden sunset, as he puts it, as the dust returns to the earth and the spirit to meet its maker. Now, at the end of our book, when all is said and done, I briefly address Qohelet's liturgical placement in the Jewish ritual calendar, as some, maybe most of you know, will be reading Qohelet in the synagogue 2 Shabbatot down the line, not this coming Sabbath, but the one after. Sukkot is, of course, dedicated, which is read during the festival of Tabernacles, Sukkot, deemed by the rabbis to be the most joyous of Jewish festivals. So Sukkot is, of course, dedicated in the main to exchanging our permanent dwellings for taking up residence in unstable temporary booths in celebration of our essentially transient, time-bound existence, and in expression of the joyful satisfaction, the simcha, which is another of Qohelet's key concepts, in realizing that we can pursue divinely sanctioned lives of real value despite our thoroughgoing Hevel existence. Thank you so very much.
I can't express how honored I am to be with you all today. I'm so grateful to Thea for inviting us and to Jacob for moderating this wonderful session. And of course, to Menachem for this adventure over the past years. I also need to thank Sharon and Stephen Lieberman of my community here in Potomac, Maryland, for their support of the publication of this work. My first conversation with Qohelet was triggered by the shock of the sudden death by traffic accident of a much beloved stepbrother on the eve of Yom Kippur, Ziyat Sites in just another couple of days, of course, when I was 31. One night soon after, for reasons I cannot remember, I picked up Qohelet in my parents' library and spent the rest of the evening pacing their foyer, glued to this hitherto remote book. Before that, I dutifully followed the annual synagogue chanting of Qohelet on Sukkot, but never paid much attention to it. But that night, the phrase, "Oh, he understands how random, how arbitrary death can be," reverberated in my head and never faded. I made a couple of false, but I connected to the idea of doing doing an illuminated book of Qohelet. I made a couple of false starts at it over a few years, but knew that Qohelet was saying something more than I was understanding. About 25 years later, at a Shabbat dinner at Menachem's and his wife's Chana's home, during a Meet the Family trip to Israel, shortly after my second husband's and my wedding, Menachem and I are second cousins, Menachem casually asked me about my plans for my next project. I shook my head and replied that I really wanted to work on Qohelet, but had wandered into a fog bank each time I tried. "Oh, I've written on Qohelet. Let me send you the article," he offered. The following week, I downloaded and devoured said article, and lo, light suddenly began to pierce the mists. Menachem adventurously agreed to discuss a joint project, but he was more than slightly puzzled about how one might go about visualizing this entirely abstract text. But that's my job. Now, you might well ask, well, very nice, but what is the point of this archaic medium altogether now in this era of never mind printing, but the internet and AI? let me answer this today by sharing with you the ways that I approach the creation of modern Hebrew illuminated manuscripts, and then showing you some of the 60 illuminations themselves. You'll see how an illuminated manuscript can do far more than enhance the aesthetics and emotions of a reader's experience, but actually interpret and amplify the subtleties of the text, its relationship to our greater world, in a coherent visual midrash. Here, a leisurely contemplative gaze at its imagery brings to human level complex ideas about Qohelet's intent, as Menachem has revealed it, and detects the reverberations of this odd but vital text across not only the Jewish culture that produced, protected, and cherished it, but also across 2 millennia of Western Judeo-Christian culture. A painting, or a sculpture for that matter, can communicate dozens of ideas instantly, and an illumination fuses our words and images, tying us to 2 millennia of our visual and intellectual cultures beautifully. This 1434 painting, which many of you probably know well, is from the hand of an artist who came out of the tradition of illuminated manuscripts. Now, this painting has taught me almost everything I know about building the meaning of a painting. I work daily under a reproduction, and a visit with it in the National Gallery has been just about my first stop on even the briefest trip to London since I was in my late teens. The religious and ethical value of every single item you see here adds up to a detailed moral and ethical marriage contract between 2 15th century young people, not simply a fusion of 2 Florentine banking families. Just a few examples. The little dog represents fidelity, the sabots or clogs, protection from the elements, the single candle glowing in the chandelier, the light of Jesus, and under the mirror, the artist witnessed Jan van Eyck was here. Now, obviously, since I work within Jewish tradition, my imagery is entirely different from that of 15th century Christianity. Mine is based in other biblical texts, colorful exegesis from many rabbinic sources, and many avenues of Western thought and science. However, unlike Van Eyck and his tradition, I've needed to develop most of this iconographic vocabulary myself. Jewish cultures, whether Eastern or Western, have rich and ancient traditions of visual art, but the imagery has tended to be narrative or sheerly decorative, rarely expressing abstract ideas. The second commandment prohibition on portraying God has a little to do with this, but really not very much, since Jewish art is full of human imagery. With a few famous exceptions, the prohibition is really related only to envisioning the divine, and that is taken very seriously, as I do as well. My sense is that the lack of abstract idea in Jewish visual art, whereas our literature is full of highly visual abstraction, is largely a matter of the generally high level of literacy among historical Jewish audiences. Didactic imagery was just simply of less importance. There are a few exceptions to this absence, but only a few. Nowadays, however, as our general surrounding Western culture, which is so heavily influenced by the internet, becomes ever more visual, our minds and eyes have changed. One of my challenges over 3 decades has been to develop a modern Jewish iconographic vocabulary capable of teasing out abstract concepts in visual form, reflecting both thought native not only to expressly Jewish tradition, but also the cultural and scientific worlds within which we live. Following the lead of Van Eyck, as analyzed by Erwin Panofsky, I create disguised symbolism in a scene that usually makes logical sense, all explained in commentaries in each book. These symbolic images aren't simply plastered around the composition to be read individually, but work together, play together to create a coherent interpretation of the work, melding classical readings with reflections from my cultural surround as a 20th and 21st century Western woman. How do I construct my visual midrash? Well, Moshe Halbertal has described Jewish culture as a text-centered community, and my own interpretive work is nothing if not text-centered. Each project begins with some years studying the chosen text, in this case Qohelet, along with its rabbinic commentaries and modern academic Bible studies. There are also regular discussions with my collaborators. Menachem and I work together by Zoom. I begin each painting by writing, and as I consider each passage, many more associations spring to mind, and I develop a mental picture of where I want to go. I rarely sketch these anymore. The layout happens in my mind, and then I set to work, laying out text and micrography first, proofing, and then painting in gouache, and finally gilding. I usually include some element of paper cutting, another medium traditional to the Jewish manuscript arts, but in this book, Qohelet, I've only used it in the flyleaves. Since one always sees a two-page spread in a book, I paint both facing illuminations together. Here, I base my visual midrash of Qohelet that runs through 60 paintings on Menachem's Hevel premise, that the human lifespan is short, and not only we, but all our discrete deeds are transient. Nothing lasts forever. And separated as we are from the divine, we cannot possibly fathom God's expectations of us, although we know we ultimately face divine judgment. Let me show you how this visual midrash of Qohelet works. The micrographic border surrounding the painting presents roughly the first third of Qohelet. So why the Alhambra? This corresponds to Menachem's Hevel premise directly. Our grandest, most exquisite monuments are ephemeral, just as are our lives and endeavors. And of course, Qohelet dons the cloak of the great King Solomon's kind of an avatar as he analyzes the human condition. In the paintings ahead, I compare human life and deeds, labors, as Qohelet would say, to a grand and gorgeous palace full of lives bursting with action and conversation, beauty and tragedy. Yet even this grandeur will crumble in time. This palace metaphor draws upon a tradition common in Midrash, comparing the heavens to a palace and the human world to an orchard or garden. I extend the metaphor to human life and deeds. And what grander palace than the Alhambra, the wondrously beautiful medieval palace and gardens of the Muslim Nasrid rulers of Granada. The Alhambra also hosted much of the vibrant poetry-filled court life of the medieval Spanish or Sephardic community. And yet, for all its glory, all the almost audible ghosts of the glittering and powerful people who strode its expanses, if you look into the corners now of its mosaic-encrusted walls, if you look at the stonework lining its garden paths, you see that even this massive glory crumbles slowly into the red dust from which it arose. The golden rim of the painting here alludes to the golden bowl in the 12th chapter, not yet cracked here, and haunts the entire manuscript. So while the Alhambra provides the setting and the central metaphor, I flesh out the sense of the fragile and fugitive beauty of human experience with iconography drawn from related biblical and other Jewish texts, from archaeology, the natural world, science, and far more modern icons relating to issues that Qohelet explores. I include poetry and prose not only from the Hebrew Bible, but from across Western civilization to help reveal the enduring reality of Qohelet's thought across millennia and landscapes far from his own. An area of mist penetrates every painting, always reminding us of the ephemerality of all human deeds. I introduce all of these to conjure up a visual midrash, probing Qohelet's struggle to understand the workings of the universe, to find wisdom. That is what God demands of us, despite our transience and vantage point under the sun. On the Hebrew page here, the philosopher's eye, Menachem's, peers through the initial letter. The plain clay jar spilling the jewels that tumble down around the words describes, in a midrash quoted for each of the books quoted for Solomon, or rather attributed to Solomon, that wise king's unsealing of the wisdom of Torah. The rabbis compare the Torah to a seal jar full of jewels, but only when open and spilled could the riches be found. This was Solomon when he composed Qohelet. I'll leave you to explore the meaning of the English painting in the book. The philosopher compares the immutable cycle of life to the daily journey of the sun and to the water cycle, all three, at least until recently, beyond the reach of human will and action. The mosaic repeats its own complex, man-made patterns endlessly, in colors that echo the sea, sky, sunlight, and forests. Outside, ephemeral mist, hevel, rises from the gardens below into the clouds, only to fall to land and sea as rain. The cloud of micrographic text in the Hebrew Illumination includes passages of the 11th century Spanish Jewish philosopher and poet, Shlomo ibn Gabirol's Neoplatonic tract in verse, The Royal Crown, Keter Malchut. He, incidentally, lived and worked in the Alhambra for some time, although granted in an earlier, far less grand incarnation. The first passage ponders our inability to comprehend God's eternity. The second laments the clouds of human imperfection that obscure humanity's view of divine wisdom, likened here to light. Gazing from his high tower, the omnipotent ruler struggles to accept that he cannot rise from under the sun to perceive divine wisdom. He despairs of the ephemerality of even his rich and powerful life. The Hebrew ani rests upon a regal carpet, while the glittering gold between the lines fit for royal manuscript seem to ridicule the earth-bound philosopher's inability to find heavenly wisdom. The English pronoun I rests upon a clay bulla of the Judean royal seal. The balustrade upon which he rests is from the ruins of the Judean palace at Ramat Rachel, hinting at the monumental palace that Qohelet's Solomon avatar inhabits. Now we see a Hubble Space Telescope image of the ultra-deep field of space in the background, which I have long used to symbolize God's invisible but all-suffusing presence, and in this book in particular, to allude to how every particle of our world cycles endlessly through the stars. Can one find wisdom by indulging in luxury? Qohelet's sensual pleasure and pride in his material achievements are clouded by his realization that all his luxuries will evaporate. In the Hebrew Illumination, Qohelet gazes upon his irrigated orchards and vineyards. This Persian period philosopher would already associate water flowing in this arid land with the wisdom of Torah, a ubiquitous metaphor found throughout the prophets and writings. The cherry branches, emblematic of the seat of American power in Washington, D.C., where these illuminations were painted, progressed through their annual cycle, reminding him of the passing of generations. Despite Qohelet's pride in all the beauty he has amassed, the drifting fog reminds him of the ephemerality of all his wealth here under the sun. By the latter part of the second chapter, as Menachem has described, the philosopher king has plunged into despair as he realizes that there is no way for even the wisest, most powerful of humans to reach up to grasp divine wisdom, that all his riches and accomplishments will evaporate. Vanished are the luxuriant views of orchards and vineyards. Instead, angrily broken jewelry, a golden chain, and precious, then already antique carnelian beads that he might have given his wife or lover, lie broken amid his words, and the calligraphy of the very words pales and twists and burns with his misery. Now, just a few words about these paintings of perhaps the most beloved part of Qohelet. At right, with the first verse of the chapter, the philosopher king gazes into a garden pond, again alluding to the golden bowl of chapter 12, and no, not yet cracked. Qohelet begins to find comfort in human limitations on wisdom as he meditates further on how every situation in life has its moment, even if that moment is unknowable to any but God. He perceives life as a stream, its beginning and end obscure, always subject to sudden turbulence. The little mosaic at the top of the stream bears a fragment of the musical notation of what else but Pete Seeger's famous 1965 song setting of the poem, Turn, Turn, Turn. And now for something completely different. Qohelet turns to consider the foolishness of oppressors and plutocrats in the face of both human and divine authority. The Hebrew illumination presents the ancient flail and sword, while the English illumination begins with more modern tools of oppression, and coins spill everywhere. Again, the starlit heavens of the Hubble image, again, divine intent, obscured from human view by clouds of mist. Now, Qohelet warns his students to avoid hazardous behavior and instead pursue wise, careful self-conduct. He contrasts two metaphorical images of women current in his day to sketch the tug of war between wisdom and foolishness. Now, this passage is often assumed to be a bit of misogyny, but I would suggest that the gendered language itself argues against so literal a reading, although there is a place for it. Chokhmah, wisdom, the object of Qohelet's search, is a feminine word. Throughout the book of Proverbs, which is roughly contemporary with Qohelet, wisdom is characterized as a woman, a teacher and a model for all humankind. Indeed, Proverbs ends with the famous passage, Eshet Chayil, a powerful woman in Ray Shendlin's translation for our Kabbalat Shabbat book, the paean to the wise and capable mother, homemaker, and businesswoman, all faces of Lady Wisdom. Conversely, Qohelet warns of the dangers of temptation by reckless, illicit women, characterized in Proverbs 9:13 by the feminine gender, ksilut, of the same word, ksil, fool, that Qohelet continually applies to his negative role model. At left, two micrographic texts contrast the two symbolic women. The wise woman, at the far right in blue, gathers her fruit, household keys dangling from her waist. She is composed of this passage, Eshet Chayil, a powerful woman, and verses from Proverbs 9, all praising Lady Wisdom. At the left, a dancing woman in the red, a dancing woman such as one might have seen at evening entertainments in the Alhambra, rattles a tambourine. She is composed of the aria Libbiamo in the first act of Verdi's La Traviata, the interchange between the courtesan Violetta and Alfredo Germont. In contrast to the wise and prudent woman across the page, these soon-to-be lovers sing to each other about how life is all about embracing the pleasures of the moment. Now, this is a good place to show you another image that appears here, and in fact on every painting. You can see a small honeybee on each painting. My name, Dvorah, is the Hebrew word for honeybee, and although I do indeed keep bees nowadays, since long before that, placing a bee in each painting has been my play on the medieval custom of the colophon, identifying a scribe. Here, Qohelet has moved on to consider the difficulties of a person of integrity serving a corrupt ruler. The Illuminations offer cautionary images for both the arrogant ruler and the honest courtier. We see a painting of a marble statue of justice pulling down her blindfold and winking. In contrast, the bordering calligraphy offers the very passage, "Justice, justice you shall pursue," from Deuteronomy 16, that famously requires the ruler to pursue honest and even-handed justice for all people. The English text begins with a painting showing a crown lying in a gutter, a cautionary tale inspired by both Napoleon's remark about the crown of France lying in the gutter and General George Patton's observation that at Roman generals' triumph parades, a slave stood behind the conqueror holding a golden crown and whispering in his ear a warning that all glory is fleeting. The decorative text bordering the English page illustrates the dangers attendant upon the honest courtier with Cordelia's speech from the beginning of King Lear, and I put that at the left. And finally, Qohelet arrives at the answer to his search for wisdom. His royal avatar gazes out from his orderly farmland and catches sight of a small but wise farmer working the land, dividing it into areas of different treatment. Some wither and some flourish. Cast thy bread upon the waters, he says, for thou shalt find it after many days. Give a portion of 7, even to 8, for you know not what evil shall be upon the earth. So take your chances, make your contingency plans. Some plans will go awry, but some will flourish. This is the key to survival, to fulfillment in all your labors, and to wisdom. As he muses, his hand rests beside his beloved's, while the olives symbolize both his nobility and his growing family, the pomegranate branch their fruitfulness, and the bottle of wine his sanctification of God rather, and his joy. Qohelet has found the elusive secret to a meaningful life beneath the unknowable heavens. We're nearing the end of Qohelet's reflections, the gentle and poetic ode to death. The Talmudic motto, "Know before whom you stand," crowns the great portal to this palace, just as it often crowns the Holy Ark in synagogues across the centuries. All of the diverse and busy lives lived in this palace, whether child or adult, laborer or scholar or aristocrat, all paths lead away from the sunlit courtyard toward shadow, oblivion, and certain divine judgment. We see in the foreground a fragile elderly laborer lugging a basket of grapes destined for a rich table, pregnant women celebrating each other's joy, children and aristocrats, and then in the distance, an old man hobbles into the inescapable, misty darkness at the end of the grand halls. Even the solid stone palace itself is ephemeral. The golden bowl of the courtyard fountain not only sprays, but also leaks the water that's essential to human life. Weeds have invaded the meticulously laid courtyard tiles, and the intricate mosaics have begun to crumble. The almond tree is heavy with fragrant white blossoms, likely a contemporary idiom for the white hair of old age. Nothing in the palace of human existence, even in this grandest of palaces, lasts forever. Then what does last forever if not human accomplishment? Only God. And Qohelet begins his paean to the end of human life under the sun by warning us to live constantly aware of the inevitability of divine judgment of our personal actions. The courtyard of his palace is filled with exhortations to live mindful of divine law. The pomegranate tree reminds the courtiers of fertility. We see pregnant women and the fruits of all of humankind's labors, but its many seeds also symbolize the 613 commandments. Midrashic associations with the pink lily at its root remind them of the value of the 10 commandments in the corrupt human world, and the thorny rose climbing its trunk recalls the humility of the burning bush. The grass that springs up between the courtyard tiles suggests the warning that occurs throughout biblical texts that sinners will vanish like dry grass. Think of Psalm 90. As throughout Jewish lore, the water that sprays from the fountain also symbolizes the necessity of Torah to humankind throughout our lives under the sun. Far beneath the heavens, night falls over the palace of the philosopher king. The golden bowl framing the scene, yes, has finally cracked. Now, shortly before painting these, I happened upon a book of poetry reflecting on Qohelet, composed by the first of the two 11th century Jewish grand viziers who ruled in Granada. This is Shmuel HaNagid, Samuel the Nagid. 44 of its roughly 120 poems are worked into the micrography here. One beautiful poem surrounds the text page, expressing the poet's determination to pursue life despite its transience. Soul opens inside you on beauty and then tells you to seek in the world and ignore its flaws. Heart says, you'll live forever, and death, as it speaks, grasps you with claws. Qohelet's last words rest within fig branches cycling through the seasons. Throughout Jewish lore, figs embody many qualities of Israel, humankind, and the world. Here, they hint at the birth and passing of generations and the goodness of divine law. The oak branch bears the acorns that are the oak's future. The image alludes to Israel's strength to endure despite the passing of every individual, of even the Davidic kingdom itself. Isaiah prophesied that Israel would be reborn after conquest like the terebinth and the oak, of which stumps are left, even when they are felled. Its stumps shall be like holy seed. Like the oak's seed and regenerating stump, long after his own death, Qohelet's words continue to offer humankind guidance toward a realistic yet meaningful life. So, thank you very much.
I want to reiterate, there are many, many folios that are really striking that have not been shown by her. So this is not an exhaustive view of her really amazing work. Ecclesiastes 9, Qohelet 9:10. Everything that's in your hand to do it with all your might. Do you think that gets at the heart of the message? That was told to me. That's kind of the takeaway. Professor Fisch, you want to say something to that verse?
Yeah, I mean, but you need to understand, at least according to my reading, is the diversity of your capabilities, what you have strength to do, what is it to grasp something. I mean, if that verse is read is given an absolutist meaning, we'll be missing the whole point. Okay, the way I would sort of render it in today's English is that every person should take responsibility for life under the sun to the best of his or her judgment, knowing well that had they been born in different circumstances, their judgment would be very different. Other people have different judgments. Use their different perspectives in order to create critical distance from your own. But take responsibility under those conditions. And I think, I mean, this is for a different talk completely, but this captures the Hillelite character of the Talmudic literature. And that Talmudic literature has the Hillelites responsible for canonizing Qohelet, while the Shammaites would rather have not, which is a giveaway phrase in the Mishnah. And just to add one sentence to that, I mean, Talmudic biblical exegesis takes the Bible very, very, very seriously, but never, ever, even once, claims to have disclosed the God-given truth of any one verse. It's always a diversity of opinions which are never, ever, ever adjudicated. So it's that notion of Torah study, right, which allows for the full diversity of human perspective, not as a mistake, not as something that has gone wrong on the way, but as the human condition, with God's word being refracted in accord with that diversity. Multiplicity of convictions and commitments. That's the time-boundedness. That's the context. You know, we're time-bound. We are the children of our circumstances. Every single person in this Zoom meeting knows absolutely that if we were born in a different time and a different culture, my favorite example, if I were born to a sumo wrestling family in Japan, I'd be very, very different. My judgments would be different. What I thought right and wrong and worthy and a life worth living would be different. So how do you manage that diversity within a religious context? And I think this is what renders Qohelet a profound philosopher of religion. If you read him, I mean, it all hinges on Hevel. If you read Hevel the way I suggest, this book kind of opens up very differently than the way it's usually read.
I want to give the last word to Debra, who really has curated this work, has brought together the insights of Professor Fisch, which I want to reiterate, the stuff about how Qohelet helps us stay true to a principle even while we question that principle. That tension is really central to his writing. So it's something that you're not going to find in any other work on Qohelet. But to Debra, we thank you. And can you please give us a last and final word as we part ways?
This text has, I've grown up as a traditionally observant, modern Orthodox Jew, but I would now, since probably reading Menachem's first essay and really digging into this, Qohelet has really come to dominate my view of Jewish life. We have law, there is going to be judgment, nothing's permanent, you have to use your own judgment, keeping in mind that there is divine judgment, and that everything is subject to change. And it's a very profound text for me.
If I could add just one half sentence, it's not merely about the diversity of conviction, but that diversity has value, because within that multifaceted conversation and within, in the echo chamber of being criticized by people who think differently, you enrich your own position in ways you could never achieve by talking to yourself. So there's something about, if I may quote Rabbi Zach's title, he talks about the dignity of difference. I think Qohelet is about the value of difference, which is a massive step beyond mere dignity.
On behalf of us all, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you,
Thea.
Thea.